At the family BBQ, my brother's son said, "Charity cases eat last," and they giggled. I put my plate down and walked out. Dad texted, "The business needs your investment." I replied, "Never again." One notice went out and their laughter turned to tears. The humidity at the lake house was a wet wool blanket pressing down on the Vanguard anniversary party. My parents spent $50,000 on white tents and sweating quartets to mask their insolvency. Christopher stood by the bar, mocking my life while drinking my secret capital. I sat in my penthouse overlooking the financial district, letting the silence wash over me. The air here smelled of lemon verbena and filtered precision. For 31 years, I acted as the structural integrity for a family that viewed me as a back-office paper pusher. They never suspected that their invisible daughter managed hundreds of millions in assets. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating a face they would no longer recognize. My hand remained perfectly steady as I logged into the ironclad capital portal. The account was overdrawn. My phone buzzed with another frantic text from Joseph. He wanted a bridge loan to cover the fleet expansion he had already over-leveraged. He spoke of family legacy while his grandson learned to sneer at my empty plate. 5 years ago, I saved them with an anonymous $5 million injection out of a misguided sense of duty. Now, I composed a secure email to my attorney. I exercised the liquidity event clause under Section 4 of our agreement. The digital clock flickered toward midnight. I was calling in the debt. The next morning, the notice hit my father's inbox like a physical blow. By noon, the reports from my lawyer confirmed the panic. Vanguard had 30 days to produce $13 million or face a forced sale. Christopher tried to storm my building, but my security turned him away like a common solicitor. I watched him from the balcony as he screamed into his phone on the sidewalk. He looked small and desperate without the company credit card. The banks had already frozen their lines. The trap was finally shut. The closing meeting occurred on the 42nd floor of my firm. My family huddled at the far end of the mahogany table, looking gray and ancient. They expected to meet a faceless corporate shark to negotiate their exit packages. When I walked in wearing a tailored black suit, Christopher actually told me to leave. I sat in the chairman's chair and slid the audit across the table. I detailed every cent they had embezzled for Cabo trips and luxury leases. They stared at me with terrified, greedy eyes. The hierarchy had finally inverted. I picked up the corporate credit cards from the table and produced a pair of silver scissors. Joseph pleaded for a transition period, claiming he was still the patriarch. I told him he was simply a liability before cutting his platinum card in half. Their total misappropriated spending eclipsed their remaining equity, leaving them with nothing but their shame. Christopher began to weep when he realized the SUV was gone. I walked out into the cool hallway without looking back. The air was finally clean. I ate my dinner in silence. The silence in my apartment was a physical presence, a sanctuary built from decades of their neglect. I stood by the floor, to ceiling glass, watching the city pulse like a distant circuit board. My hand brushed the mahogany desk, feeling the cool grain of a life they never bothered to imagine. I didn't feel the rush of victory yet. Instead, there was a heavy, clinical stillness. For 30 years, I was the transparent child. Now, I was the only wall still standing. I opened a leather-bound ledger where I kept the real history of Vanguard logistics. The numbers were an autopsy of my father's vanity and my brother's incompetence. I saw the $5 million injection I had funneled through Ironclad Capital 5 years ago. It was supposed to be a bridge, but they had turned it into a pier that led nowhere. They bought shiny toys while the engine rotted. My phone buzzed on the desk. Joseph was calling for the 9th time today. I finally swiped to answer, keeping my voice a flat line of professional indifference. He didn't ask how I was or why I had left the party early. He launched into a frantic speech about aggressive investors and unfair legal maneuvers. I could hear the clink of a Scotch glass against his wedding ring on the other end. He was terrified, but his pride was still trying to dictate the terms. He still thought I was his little girl. "Rachel, you have to talk to your bank contacts," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a manufactured warmth. "We just need a few $100,000 to show liquidity. Christopher is beside himself with worry about the kids." I looked at the audit on my screen, specifically the $75,000 Christopher spent in Cabo. The irony was a bitter pill that I swallowed without a sound. They were asking the bank they had robbed to give them another loan. "I can't help you, Dad?" I said, my thumb tracing the edge of my laptop. The line went silent for 3 seconds before his tone shifted from pleading to a sharp, familiar bite. He called me selfish and reminded me of the tuition they had paid 20 years ago. He spoke of family loyalty as if it were a one-way street paved with my sacrifice. I hung up mid-sentence. The rejection felt like a door locking in a very cold room. I called David, my attorney, and gave him the final instruction to initiate the clawback. We weren't just selling the company anymore, we were going after the personal assets used for their embezzlement. This was the irreversible decision that would strip the lake house from their grasp and the luxury cars from their driveways. David sounded impressed by my lack of hesitation. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply being accurate. The debt had to be settled in full. A notification popped up on my social media feed from Christopher's wife, Morgan. It was a photo of the family at the BBQ, cropped to remove me entirely. The caption read that true family sticks together when outsiders try to tear them down. I realized then that they still didn't know I was the outsider. They were still planning their next vacation on my dime. I smiled, a small and dangerous thing. Tomorrow, the eviction notices would be served at dawn. The sunrise over the financial district was a jagged line of gold and gray. I hadn't slept, but my mind felt like a sharpened blade. I walked toward the boardroom of my private firm, the heels of my shoes echoing like a countdown. Today was the deadline for Vanguard to respond to the liquidity demand. I needed to see their reaction before the final hammer fell. My objective was simple: force a total confession of their financial crimes. I met David in the hallway, his face a mask of professional concern. He handed me a folder containing the morning's communications. Joseph had sent a legal response claiming that the ironclad contract was predatory and void. It was a desperate move from a man who had run out of legitimate options. They were trying to litigate their way out of a debt they couldn't even quantify. I felt a surge of cold pity for their predictable arrogance. We sat in the darkened conference room, waiting for the video link to connect. When my father's face appeared on the large monitor, he looked 10 years older. His tie was loose, and his eyes were bloodshot from a night of panic. He didn't see me because I was sitting off camera, watching his mask crumble. He spoke to David with a trembling aggression, demanding to speak to the principal investor immediately. He was still trying to dominate. "The investor is listening," David said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. Joseph leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He began to offer a settlement that was insulting in its inadequacy. He proposed paying back $3 million over 10 years while keeping the company operations intact. He talked about Christopher's brilliant leadership and the family's deep roots in the community. He was selling a ghost to a woman who knew the grave was empty. Suddenly, Christopher burst into my father's office, his face red with a manic energy. He was holding a stack of papers and shouting about a private equity firm he had contacted. He claimed they were willing to buy out the predatory investor and save the family legacy. It was a lie, of course. I knew every firm in the city, and none of them would touch a sinking ship like Vanguard. Christopher was hallucinating a rescue to avoid the truth. I leaned into the camera's view, my expression perfectly neutral. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Christopher dropped the papers he was holding, the white sheets scattering across the floor like winter leaves. They stared at me through the screen, their realities fracturing in real time. I didn't say a word for a full minute. I let the weight of my presence crush their remaining hope. "The offer is rejected," I said, my voice steady and quiet. I ended the call before they could respond, the screen fading to a flat black. David looked at me, a question in his eyes about our next move. I stood up and straightened my jacket, feeling the finality of the moment. We were moving to the forced sale immediately. Then a new email alert chimed on my laptop. Joseph had just transferred the remaining company pension funds to his private account. The pension fund alert was a siren in the quiet room. I watched the digital tracker confirm the outbound wire transfer. My father had crossed the final line into criminal liability. He was no longer just a failing businessman. He was a thief stealing from the drivers and warehouse staff who had built his name. My objective shifted instantly from a buyout to a total freeze. I had to stop the bleeding before the workers lost everything. I signaled David to alert our contact at the Federal Banking Authority. The pressure in the room intensified as we waited for the confirmation. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a felony in progress. I felt a cold, sharp focus replace the lingering pity I had for Joseph. He had sacrificed the company's integrity to save his own skin. He thought he could outrun the audit. He forgot that I built the system he was using. 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence before the secondary alert chimed. The wire was flagged and held in escrow. Joseph's desperation had triggered a fraud lock on the Vanguard master accounts. He had essentially locked himself out of his own kingdom. I could see the live updates on my monitor as his access privileges were revoked one by one. The power balance didn't just tip. It collapsed entirely. He was now an observer in his own destruction. I received a panicked call from Christopher's wife, Morgan. She was at a jewelry store trying to sell her wedding ring for quick cash. She claimed that Christopher had disappeared with the keys to the lake house and a bottle of gin. The facade was crumbling faster than I anticipated. Morgan begged me to intervene for the sake of the children. I could hear the clerk in the background, refusing her credit cards. The social hierarchy had officially burned down. "Tell Christopher to go home, Morgan," I said. My voice was a steady chill that matched the air in the boardroom. I didn't offer her money or sympathy. I only offered her the truth. The world they inhabited was an illusion built on my silence. That silence was now a roar. I hung up the phone and watched David prepare the emergency injunction. We were moving to seize the physical assets by sunset. The Vanguard trucks would stop moving today. We walked toward the elevator to head to the courthouse. My heels clicked on the marble floor, with a rhythmic finality. I felt the weight of the thousands of lives, currently tied to my father's reckless theft. I wasn't the glass child anymore. I was the structural support that had decided to move. David checked his phone and frowned as the doors opened. He showed me a grainy photo sent from a private investigator. Christopher was at the docks. The image showed my brother standing near the edge of a shipping container. He wasn't alone. A group of men in suits I didn't recognize were surrounding him. They weren't bankers or lawyers. They were the high-interest lenders Joseph had warned me about months ago. It seemed my family had been hiding a much darker debt than just my $5 million. The company wasn't just insolvent. It was collateral for people who didn't use contracts to settle their accounts. The grainy photo of the docks changed everything. My objective was to seize assets, but now I had to stop a slaughter. These men weren't interested in litigation or fair market value. They were shadows from my father's secret ledger. I gripped the railing of the elevator as we descended toward the lobby. The pressure in my chest was a cold, iron weight. Christopher was a fool, but he was still my brother. He was currently drowning in deep water. I ordered David to stay back and coordinate with the authorities. I stepped into the humid morning air and hailed my driver. The car sped toward the industrial district, weaving through thick traffic. My phone buzzed with a direct message from an unknown number. It was a picture of the Vanguard fleet, keys resting on a rusted barrel. The shadow lenders had already bypassed my legal freezes. They were taking their payment in iron and rubber. This wasn't a business. The docks smelled of salt, diesel, and rotting timber. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the sound of shouting. Christopher was on his knees, his expensive suit ruined by grease and gravel. The men surrounding him looked bored, which was far more terrifying than anger. One held a heavy wrench, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. I didn't hide. I walked directly into the center of the circle. My presence was the only currency left. "The keys don't belong to him," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. The lead man turned, his eyes scanning my tailored suit and steady hands. He didn't care about my name or my title. He only cared about the $13 million Joseph had promised him. I realized then that my father hadn't just embezzled for luxury. He had been paying off a predatory loan that was doubling every month. The company was a corpse being picked clean. I pulled out my phone and displayed the frozen wire transfer alert. I explained that the money was currently in federal escrow and untouchable. If they touched Christopher, the investigation would turn into a murder hunt, and nobody would get paid. The power balance shifted as the lead man lowered his wrench. He saw the logic in my coldness. I offered them a controlled exit in exchange for my brother's life. It was the hardest trade of my entire career. They agreed to walk away with 3 trucks and a warehouse lease. It was a staggering loss, but it bought Christopher a second chance. My brother looked up at me, his face a mask of shame and terror. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't even meet my gaze. I watched the men drive away, their taillights disappearing into the gray fog. The immediate threat was gone. I realized I had just saved the man who called me a charity case. As I helped Christopher up, my phone vibrated with a notification from the lake house. The security cameras showed my father standing on the pier with a gas can. He wasn't trying to run anymore. He was preparing to burn the evidence and the legacy together. I had saved my brother at the docks, but my father was currently lighting a match. The glass child was finally breaking under the heat. We were running out of time to stop the fire. The drive to the lake house was a blur of high-speed turns and rising smoke. My objective was to prevent my father from destroying the evidence of his own crimes. I could see the orange glow reflecting off the surface of the water as we approached the gate. The primary obstacle was the sheer heat of his desperation. He had nothing left but the flames. Christopher sat beside me, shivering in his ruined suit. He was a shell of a man, watching his childhood home burn. I leaped from the car before it fully stopped. The smell of gasoline was thick and choking in the heavy night air. Joseph stood on the wooden pier, holding a red canister above a pile of ledger books. He looked like a specter in the firelight, his eyes wild and unfocused. I shouted his name, but the roar of the fire swallowed my voice. He wasn't just burning papers. He was trying to erase the 30 years of lies that had defined our family name. I stepped onto the pier, feeling the wood groan beneath my weight. Every step forward was a battle against the searing heat and my own fear. Joseph turned toward me, his face a mask of sweat and soot. He screamed that I had betrayed the legacy by bringing in the auditors. He believed that his theft was a sacred right of ownership. The power balance shifted when he slipped on a patch of fuel. The canister clattered to the boards, spilling toward the open water. I grabbed his arm as he stumbled toward the edge. He was surprisingly light, as if the loss of his status had literally reduced his mass. I pulled him back toward the shore, away from the collapsing deck. The ledger books were already black ash, drifting upward into the dark sky. We collapsed onto the wet grass as the first fire engine sirens wailed in the distance. The pier crumbled into the lake with a hiss of steam. The evidence was gone, but so was his dignity. Christopher approached us, his face illuminated by the flashing red lights. He looked at our father with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. The golden child had finally seen the leaden reality of his hero. Joseph began to weep, a jagged sound that made my skin crawl. He kept repeating that he did it for us. It was the ultimate lie of the narcissist. He did it for the country club and the shiny trucks. He did it so he could feel like a king. The fire chief approached with a grim expression on his soot-stained face. He informed us that the structure was a total loss. I felt a strange sense of relief watching the white tents melt into the lawn. The stage for their performative wealth was finally gone. I, Rachel, looked at my hands, which were blistered and shaking. I had saved the man who had ignored me for 3 decades. It was a transaction I hadn't planned on making. I felt hollow and cold despite the fire. David arrived an hour later with a team of investigators. They began to tape off the scene as if it were a fresh grave. Joseph was led to an ambulance to be treated for smoke inhalation. He looked small and broken beneath the heavy gray blanket. Christopher sat on the bumper of the car, staring at the ruins of his inheritance. He realized then that there was no money left to inherit. The debt had consumed the house and the name. Everything was zero. I stood by the water, watching the dawn break through the smoke. My phone buzzed with a message from the private equity firm. They were pulling out of the deal because of the fire. The company was now truly worthless, a pile of scorched iron and legal liabilities. This was the complication I hadn't seen coming. My $13 million exit had just vanished into the atmosphere, along with my collateral. I was no longer a wealthy shark. I was just a woman standing in a ruined garden. I looked at the charred remains of the buffet table, where Mason had mocked me. The silver shrimp platters were warped and blackened by the heat. I realized that my own wealth was also tied up in the Vanguard equity I had used as collateral. By saving my brother and father, I had essentially bankrupted myself. The irony was a cold weight in my stomach. I was the charity case now. I had traded my entire future for a family that never even loved me. I turned away from the lake and walked toward the gate. Christopher called out my name, but I didn't stop. I had no more words for him or the man in the ambulance. I had one remaining account that hadn't been settled. My private trading logs were still at the penthouse. If I could reach the city before the markets opened, I might be able to salvage something. The glass child was broken, but the shards were still sharp. I had one last trade to make. The car sped through the Pradon gloom toward the financial district. My objective was the high-frequency trading terminal in my study. I needed to hedge my remaining positions before the news of the Vanguard fire hit the wires. If the market opened with the company in ruins, my personal collateral would vanish instantly. The primary obstacle was the ticking clock on the dashboard. I watched the minutes bleed away as we hit a wall of early morning tunnel traffic. My palms were slick against the leather seat. I burst into my apartment at 8:50, 5 in the morning. The air was still and smelled of lemon verbena, a haunting contrast to the smoke on my skin. I reached the terminal and saw the red numbers flickering, like warning lights. My leverage was extreme. I had bet everything on the stability of the Vanguard liquidation. Now, the private equity firm's withdrawal was a leak that would soon become a flood. I began the rapid sell-off, my fingers flying across the keys with desperate precision. Suddenly, a system lock appeared on my primary screen. My trading privileges were suspended pending a margin call. The broker had already seen the fire footage on the early news. The power balance shifted as the terminal went cold and unresponsive. I was frozen out of my own accounts at the exact moment I needed to act. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the weight of 30 years of careful building turning to dust. I was standing on a ledge with no safety net. I called my broker, Sarah, but her voice was a wall of corporate policy. She explained that the Vanguard fire was classified as a material change in risk. They required an immediate cash injection of $4 million to keep my other positions open. I didn't have it. My liquidity was tied to the very deal that just gone up in flames. I realized that my father's arson hadn't just burned his legacy. It had ignited my entire financial existence. I felt a cold, hollow terror. I looked at the mahogany desk and saw the leather bound ledger I had pulled from the fire. It was scorched and wet, but the center pages were still intact. I opened it and found a hidden account number registered in the Cayman Islands. This was the secret slush fund Joseph had used for his final embezzlement. It contained exactly $4.2 million. It was the money he had stolen from the workers' pensions. If I used it, I could save my own life. I stared at the numbers for a full minute. The moral line I had drawn was suddenly blurred by the threat of total ruin. Using that money would make me a thief, just like Joseph. But letting it sit meant losing my sanctuary and my future. I could hear the city waking up outside my window. The hum of the streets felt like a predatory growl. I needed to make a decision before the market bell rang at 9:30 in the morning. My legacy was currently a balance of theft. I reached for the phone to authorize the transfer from the secret account. But my hand stopped an inch from the keypad. I remembered the driver at the docks who had lost his health insurance because of Joseph's greed. If I took this money, those families would never see their pensions again. I would be the shark they always assumed I was. I slowly lowered my hand. I chose the path of earned loss over stolen survival. I let the margin call happen. The market opened, and my portfolio began to liquidate automatically. I watched 10 years of aggressive, high-stakes success evaporate in a series of automated trades. My net worth plummeted from $20 million to a few thousand in under 10 minutes. The penthouse was no longer mine. The modern art and the skyline views belonged to the bank. I sat in the center of my beautiful, empty room. I had saved my family and my soul, but I had lost everything else. I gathered a small bag of clothes and my personal laptop. I didn't feel the sting of tears I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, light buoyancy. I was no longer the glass child holding up a heavy display. The display was gone, and I was finally standing on solid ground. I walked toward the door, leaving the lemon verbena and the mahogany behind. I had one remaining asset they couldn't seize. My license was still valid. I could still manage money for others. I stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the real wind on my face. I had no car and no title, but I had my integrity. Then, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. David, my attorney, stepped out with a look of frantic urgency. He wasn't there to offer condolences. He told me that the fire investigators had found something else in the lake house ruins. It wasn't just an arson. They found a secondary vault, hidden beneath the pier that Joseph didn't even know existed. David pulled me into the car, his face pale against the city grit. My objective was clear: understand what lay beneath the scorched pier before the state seized it all. The primary obstacle was the federal freeze already settling over our assets like frost. David explained that the vault was lead, lined and watertight, surviving both the fire and the lake. Joseph never knew it was there, because it belonged to our grandfather. The power dynamic shifted as I realized the legacy was older than the lies. The drive back to the lake was a silent funeral for my former life. I looked at my empty wrists, where my watch used to sit before the margin call. We arrived at the blackened shoreline where forensic teams were still sifting through the rubble. The vault sat on the mud, a heavy iron box encrusted with decades of silt. It required a physical key, not a digital code. I reached into my bag and pulled out the antique locket my grandmother left me. The small brass key inside the locket fit the vault perfectly. The heavy door groaned open, revealing stacks of physical gold certificates and land deeds. My grandfather had anticipated the family's eventual greed and hid the true wealth beneath the boards. This was the structural integrity he had intended for me to find when the house finally fell. I was no longer a bankrupt failure. I was the sole trustee of a fortune that had never been leveraged. The account was finally settled. I looked at the certificates and realized they were worth more than the company ever was. This wasn't just money, it was a clean slate. I called the pension fund manager and authorized a full restoration of the workers' accounts. My father and brother watched from the edge of the property, guarded by state police. They saw the gold and reached out, their eyes filled with a familiar hunger. I didn't feel anger anymore. I only felt a deep, quiet distance. "You don't get a cent of this," I told them as I walked past.